What countries has NATO invaded? How is NATO destabilizing Russia other than destabilizing their imperial ambitions? See, this is how I know some of you just learned what NATO is when the war in Ukraine started. So let's do a little history lesson. NATO's first intervention was Yugoslavia in the 90s. Thousands of civilians were killed by NATO's bombs and much infrastructure was destroyed. NATO leadership claimed this was to protect human rights and stop ethnic cleansing, but critics have since argued that NATO bombed areas that were filled with civilians and were only looking out for the West's economic interests rather than actually trying to protect human rights. After the bombings, the former states of Yugoslavia had their economies restructured by the IMF and World Bank, selling off state-owned companies to Western multinationals and implementing policies of neoliberal austerity. NATO has also been involved in trying to clean up the mess created by the United States with their invasions of Afghanistan, as well as the illegal invasion of Iraq. And possibly the worst NATO crime of all came just 11 years ago with the intervention in Libya. NATO took out Muammar Gaddafi to protect human rights in Libya, which took the country from one of the most prosperous in all of Africa to a country with an open-air slave market, as warlords now fight each other in the power vacuum that was created by NATO. And keep in mind, NATO was only formed in the first place to fight the Soviet Union. And after the USSR was dissolved, NATO leadership promised Russia that they would stop expanding. But they lied and have continued to get closer and closer to Russia's borders. Much of what prompted the Russian invasion was Ukraine training NATO troops and holding military drills. And now Finland and Sweden are also floating the idea of joining NATO. And that's because NATO wants to use these countries in a proxy war against Russia. Because Russia has been going against the US's economic interests for a long time now. And that's why the US has been sanctioning them long before the war started, which is an act of economic warfare, a destabilization effort. Because Russia has been continually deepening their economic and political relationships with the US's enemies, countries like Venezuela and China. And this is part of a broader trend where these countries sanctioned by the United States are increasingly allying with each other, increasingly threatening the US's global dominance, their hegemony, and creating a multipolar world where there's no longer one dominant pole, the US and the West, NATO countries, but now another pole is rising, led by China and Russia, which NATO and the Western countries are determined to suppress. And based on NATO's violent history and their history of lying in order to protect the US's economic interests, we should be very skeptical of what they're doing in Eastern Europe. And this is why I am totally against Sweden and Finland joining NATO. It's not because I want every country in Europe to just bow down to Russia. It's because I don't want war, or nuclear war, or US hegemony. It's time for Europe to stop being the US's evil sidekick. Forget NATO, y'all. Create your own foreign policy. More trade, less war and bombs.